It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam Park and John Ramey with you, Friday, March 29th, 2024. Sam is in Los Angeles. I am in Reno, Nevada. We have an update on the Senegal election, which has taken place. Recall we had covered earlier this year that the incumbent president wanted to delay that election. That caused a big stir, and there has been an election, and there has been a winner in a landslide. Also, update in the Middle East. Russian warships are in the Red Sea. There is a ceasefire that nobody's paying attention to. And spontaneous Xi in China. The Chinese president, Xi, met with U.S. business leaders during the China Development Forum in Beijing. Also this week, Janet Yellen at the Chinese about their push towards electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. And that is a very interesting story. Sam, shall we start with Senegal?
Please.
It is the westernmost country in continental Africa. It is situated on the Atlantic coastline. It has a population of 18 million. Its annual GDP ranks 106th worldwide. And Bassirou Diomaye Faye has won the presidency of Senegal in a landslide. 54% of the vote. That means there will not need to be a runoff. That's well ahead of second place finisher Amadou Ba. The former prime minister. Ba earned not quite 36% of the vote. Those were the top two vote getters, but there were 19 total candidates in the field, Sam.
That's a lot of candidates.
It is. Remember, the incumbent, Macky Sall, attempted to postpone the election until December. The originally scheduled date for this election was February 25th. A lot of people didn't like that. There were protests. Sall was thought to be maybe trying to position Amadou Ba, the former prime minister, the leader of Sall's coalition in this election, a little bit better politically. United in Hope is the name of Macky Sall's coalition, and that's who Ba was running, the banner he was running under, but he lost.
Yes.
And it is interesting that Bassirou Diomaye Faye wins kind of on behalf of another candidate who is not allowed to run, and his name is Ousmane Sonko. That's kind of the interest.
Ousmane Sonko, yes.
Okay, yeah, it's a very, I don't know if I've ever heard of such a thing before. He's barred from running, Sonko, and he's like the fiercest critic of Sall.
Yes.
And Faye kind of wins as his
sort of a proxy, yeah, honestly.
Proxy, yeah.
Both Faye and Ousmane Sonko, interestingly to me, are former employees and officials in the tax authority of Senegal. And they've run on sort of an anti-corruption campaign, which is obviously corruption is a big issue in every country, including our own.
Certainly every bureaucracy.
Certainly. But, tax officials in Senegal, I think they've got a pretty good insight into how corruption or certain forms of corruption might work in the country. It was interesting also when I first realized that they were actually having the election, which I'd forgotten about because I wasn't sure exactly how the postponement was working or not. Every reporter that I saw reporting on the ground from Dakar, the capital of Senegal, said, oh, well, voting has begun, and but there are 19 candidates, so we're certainly going to go to a runoff. And in any case, results from the first round won't be available until Friday, that is today, right? And so, well, we won't know what's going to happen until then. Guess what? Those people took it on the chin. They were all wrong. As a matter of fact, as you say, Faye won almost immediately, and Ba conceded very quickly. Faye met with outgoing President Macky Sall, I think, 2 days ago, as in the sort of transition of power, and it's all over basically. And so it just goes to show you that in these times when we feel as though democracy is at risk in many different parts of the world, including our own, Senegal, which has had a long tradition of peaceful transfers of power from one elected government to another, has managed to keep that tradition alive, partly because of large-scale street protests at what was seen as kind of a clumsy attempt, really, by Macky Sall to first retain power for himself and then install his underling as his successor. And I wonder, and I don't think that we're ever going to find out about this, which works out well for me because it means I can't be proved wrong.
Right.
But I wonder if, for instance, as you say, there were 19 total candidates in the presidential election. I think there must have been some Senegalese voters who said, I was going to vote for candidate number 14 or whatever, right? Dude, some no hope candidate. But because of Macky Sall's attempt to retain power, I'm going to vote for Faye just to make sure that neither Macky Sall nor his handpicked successor becomes the president. I want their party out of the government. There must have been some people who did that. And so the irony for Sall is that his attempts to cling to power might, in fact, have ensured the exit from power of his own party.
It is interesting when you see a circumstance like we have been covering in Senegal, where there is the robust democratic tradition. There is a leader that maybe doesn't want to give up the reins of power despite being constitutionally mandated to do so. And there's a political price. I mean, yes. hats off to the Senegalese voters.
Absolutely. Good for them.
So 61% of eligible voters participated. The head of a group of about 100 observers from the European Union, a guy named Malin Bjork, they monitored 40 polling stations across Senegal. He said that the vote, quote, took place in a calm environment and was well organized. So you have international observers saying this election was well run. There's nothing funny about it. And essentially the voters, the people of Senegal said, no, we will keep our robust democratic traditions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think it's fantastic.
I just, as somebody who hopes that will be the case in this country, it's wonderful to see.
Yes, and this is sort of peripherally related to a number of different things that we've talked about in previous episodes of Working for Crusoe. For example, Senegal on its eastern border, that is across its eastern border, is the country of Mali. And Mali was the first of three West African or West to Central African nations whose elected civilian governments were deposed by means of military coup starting in 2021 and occurring every year thereafter so far. Mali in 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, and then last year in Niger in 2023. And that was the first one that we spoke about because we didn't have this podcast during the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso. But we talked about all three in our episode about the coup in Niger. Now, of course, if Macky Sall had managed to cling to power, that would not have been a military coup, but it still would have counted as backsliding away from democracy. So we would not have wanted to see a fourth country in a geographical block. By the way, these countries all share borders with each other in a line, sort of from west to east. So we can be relieved about it on that score as well. In addition, both Mali and Burkina Faso were prior to their coups were cooperating with the French military, who was providing assistance in combating Islamist militants in the remote interior regions of both of those countries.
These are groups like Boko Haram?
Yes. That's been at an end for a while. France has been asked to leave both of those countries, and they have, in fact, done so. This past week also, Niger asked the United States to dismantle the drone base that it operates in the remote interior of Niger. And of course, those drones also keep an eye on Islamist militants in the region. And so all three of those countries have now dispensed with Western military assistance to combat the jihadist threat. To replace the Western military assistance, they have all, or at least Mali and Burkina Faso, have turned to what used to be called the Wagner Group, the Russian private military mercenary firm. Now, of course, as we recall from last year, the head of the Wagner Group attempted a march for justice on Moscow from where he was stationed in Ukraine. This did not go well for him, and then he later died in a plane crash. Since then, the Wagner Group has been rolled up into the Russian military proper, at least on an official basis. And it's been rechristened, wait for it, the Africa Corps. which
Come on.
no, I'm serious, John, which as a student of history, you
Yeah.
and many of our listeners will recall was the name of the Nazi forces in World War II under the command of the estimable General Erwin Rommel. Now, of course, Rommel was operating considerably to the north of where the Russian Afrika Korps is operating now, but that's what they've decided to call it. Now, we
You
don't
could call
know
it a
that.
lot of you could call it a lot of things, Sam. Do you have to call it something that is evocative, like directly of the Nazis?
I guess. Now, we don't know that the Afrika Korps will be operating in Niger as
How,
well.
how is
But
that even politically popular? Russia lost tens of millions, the worst suffering in the history of warfare to defeat the Germans in the Second World War. How does that make sense in
I,
Russian
you know
society?
what? I can't really explain it
I'm
myself,
offended. Like, I'm
but
offended on behalf of the Russians.
well, you know what? I mean, I think they have a lot of other things to worry about, so
I
maybe they're
guess.
just worried about those.
I'm
Uh,
glad you waited to tell me on this episode. That is mind blowing.
isn't it though? Now, we don't know that the Afrika Korps will also be operating in Niger, but I think we can assume that they probably will be.
But
Uh,
listen, Joe Biden has framed the 21st century as this struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And as we, barrel in deeper into this 21st century, he becomes more correct all the time, it would appear. And now we've got the Russians doing things like naming one of their groups the Afrika Korps, one of their military groups, the Afrika
kind of
Korps.
on the nose.
It's like, okay, we're very clearly delineating who the good guys and the bad guys are here.
One might think. Now, but just to button this up, this also helps explain why the Islamic State mounted their terrorist attack outside of Moscow recently,
Right.
because many of these groups in the Sahel region of Africa, the Islamist groups that operate there, are in fact affiliated with Islamic State. They're going toe to toe in armed combat with the Russians even now in Africa. So why not bring that home to the Russian populace?
Okay. So, with that in mind, let's pivot to the Middle East. And I want to start with the Russian warship reported in the Red Sea, or warships, depending which reports you read. And then we'll talk about the ceasefire. Since
Sure.
we're kind of focusing on Russia and then related to China, right? Why does a Russian warship get to go in the Red Sea and not get attacked? Well, Russia is semi-aligned with China, who is buying 90% of Iran's oil, and Iran has the close relationship with the Houthis, who are the ones attacking ships in the Middle East, ostensibly in solidarity with the Palestinians. So they're attacking, they say, allies of the Israelis. But really, it's Russia's on side with China, who's on side with Iran, who have supported or somehow maybe control the Houthis. Is that why Russia can just drive their boat into the Red Sea with no consequences?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, there is freedom of navigation. There's no
Sure.
reason why they shouldn't be able to. It's not like a violation of any sort of
I understand that.
maritime law.
But what, okay, so I just read that and I've been trying to make sense of it. And I just get kind of deep into very kind of reports on non-mainstream outlets describing this and what it might mean. What do you think it means?
I don't think it really means very much. I think it's basically just a projection of power. It's kind
Okay.
of symbolic, saying, look what we can do. We can drive our ships in here. I don't think it actually changes much of anything. Now, for example,
I just wish Russia would do something that isn't like aggressive.
well, I think that
I guess I might be waiting a long time.
yeah, that's right. I think that's you're setting yourself up for disappointment here, John. But I couldn't help but notice actually that sure, the Houthis are still attacking shipping in the Red Sea. That's still going on, but they haven't been ramping it up recently. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I think we should talk about today in reference to the Middle East is what's not happening in the Middle East.
That's a great point.
And I think, for instance, the main thing and the most important thing that I think we should mention is that a ceasefire is not happening in the Middle East.
This is fascinating. I was reading the New York Times reporting on this. On Monday, the United Nations Security Council passes a resolution calling for the immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip for the remaining weeks of Ramadan, trying to break a 5-month impasse. Now, the United States had previously vetoed 3 calls for a halt to the fighting, which I was unaware of,
Yes,
or I had kind of lost in the in the fire hose of information coming at us.
that's right. Yes.
So the United States just abstained this time, and the resolution passed. And
Yes, the United States veto is another thing that is not happening.
right. So, right, exactly. So the resolution passes, but you know what else is not happening? Neither side, Israel or Hamas, have stopped fighting.
No, I
They're
mean,
bombing away.
that's right. However, for weeks now, the Israelis have been insisting that they're going to mount a full-scale ground incursion into Rafah, what they position as the last redoubt of Hamas, right along the border with Egypt at the southern end of the Gaza Strip. The incursion into Rafah is something else that is not happening in the
Right.
Middle East. They've been saying for weeks that they're going to do it. And I'm not saying they're not going to. I think eventually they will.
No, but the
But
Biden administration has kind of been scrambling to meet with Israel to maybe delay that or somehow slow its roll.
that's right. And I think that we can see, and many commentators have mentioned this, so it's not any kind of scoop on our end, which we don't generally do anyway. But many commentators have noted that there's just an increasing amount of daylight in appearing in between the Biden administration and the Israeli military. Biden has generally tried to put some distance between himself and the Israeli military policy. I think he should have done it a long time ago, and I don't think he's doing enough of it, but it's better than not doing it at all. And when I say that, I'd like to point out also that there are many voices here in the United States, very mainstream. For instance, Richard Haass, the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations here in the United States. I can't think of anybody whose job description places him more firmly in the exact center of the mainstream of the American foreign policy establishment. He was on the Ezra Klein show, I think a month ago, saying that he thought Biden should have moved away from the Israeli position earlier. And I mean, Richard Haass, I don't have any strong feelings about him either way, but
he's no radical.
He's not an apologist for Hamas by any stretch of the imagination. So it's not like if we say that Biden should try to distance himself from the Israelis, this is not some, wild-eyed radical position. This is something that very reasonable people can think without wanting to, without being accused of being somehow, apologists for terrorism, as the Israelis routinely try to paint their rhetorical opponents. So again, this is not enough for me, but it's something. And I should say also that, as you might have noticed, the death toll in Gaza is not rising anywhere near as quickly as it was a couple of months ago. We've been at just over 30,000 for a number of weeks, where for a while there, we were adding 1,000 a week on average with, over and over and over again. Now, just to be very clear, this does not mean that things are getting better.
No, famine is now the problem.
Yes, that's right. Things are still getting worse in Gaza. They're just getting worse more slowly.
And the United States is building a deep water port. And they announced this 3 weeks ago. They said it would take 60 days. So what is that? We're probably about 30, 40 days away from that actually being functional.
Yes.
So the United States will be able to supply trucks, because apparently the airdrops are like a drop in the ocean when it comes to food relief, whereas
yes, that's right.
ships with trucks will actually make a real difference in combating famine in Gaza.
Yes, I mean, everybody says trucks are where it's at. Land delivery is where it's at. And in fact, that's something that the Israelis have improved upon, but they're still not letting anywhere near enough aid in through the land crossing, and nowhere near enough. So again, it's difficult, or so I find it distasteful to think of this as progress, but at least it might help alleviate some of the horrifying suffering that's going on there. But we could go, for instance, on, I think it was Tuesday, uh, there was a mild escalation of cross-border fire on the northern border of Israel with Lebanon. But between the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and Hezbollah. Uh, and it struck me when I saw that I hadn't heard about such things happening for a number of weeks. Whereas at the beginning of the war, as we'll recall, this was the big fear.
Yeah, Hezbollah's leader was commenting about the situation in Gaza and the attacks.
The great fear was that this would escalate into a full-on regional war. And that is another thing that it seems is not happening in the Middle East right now. Yes, there was an uptick in cross-border fire on the northern border. Yes, the Houthis are still attacking shipping in the Red Sea, but these things are not escalating. We haven't heard, for example, about any Iranian-backed militia attacking U.S. forces in surrounding countries such as Iraq or Syria, which was happening quite a lot at the beginning of the war, but doesn't seem to be happening very much now. And in fact, the sort of usual unnamed sources will tell us that back-channel communications between Iran and the United States indicate that Iran is communicating that they would really rather not see an all-out war with the United States because of this. And I think that we can see from what's not happening that they really don't want that sort of war. That's good, right? It doesn't make anything better for the people in Gaza, but it does sort of make the situation not quite as horrifying as it might be. I would add that, as we'll recall, Iran recently had parliamentary elections, which were generally won by the more hardline candidates. Now, I'm not saying that Iran was mounting these sorts of attacks just to generate voter turnout amongst their hardline supporters. That's sort of a bonus, though, right? That is a good way to get some of these people to the polls. Right. And in fact, Iran has another round of parliamentary elections coming up in May. So maybe we'll see some sort of uptick before then. We'll have to see how that works out.
Sam, I always want to think about how history will judge our moment because...
Poorly? That's my guess. Is poorly?
Sure. But I have two questions about this. One, only the most extreme person would have been opposed on October 8th to Israel retaliating in defense of what Hamas perpetrated against Israel on the 7th of October. Only the most radical would have been opposed to that.
And some of them were, verbally.
But most thinking people would understand, Israel's got to fight back after that. What will we know? Do we know where that line was, where it became apparent that the Netanyahu Israeli government was over their skis and on the wrong side of kind of just common sense self-defense judgment in the eyes of the world and certainly history, because they are clearly beyond that point now. And I don't know when that happened, and I don't know when my internal sense of it changed, but it has certainly turned. And I'm curious when history will find that will define the time at which that happened.
Well, I can't really say, but one thing that
is there a singular point? Will we be able to neatly point to it was after this time, or it was above this death toll, or it was this military exercise that seemed punitive?
Let me put it this way. I think that history will think of as emblematic of that moment the speech that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer gave on the Senate floor, I believe it was last week, where he said that Netanyahu had lost his way and that there should be elections in Israel to replace him.
Schumer, a longtime friend of Israel and a Jewish American.
Not just that, I believe, and I haven't heard anybody characterize him this way in the media, which I'm sort of surprised about, but I'm relatively certain that Chuck Schumer is the highest ranking elected Jewish American politician in American history. I can't think of any, there's never been a Jewish American Speaker of the House. Chuck Schumer is the first Jewish American Senate Majority Leader. There's never been a Jewish American president.
Or vice president,
no,
R.I.P.
or
Joe
vice,
Lieberman.
yeah, the RIP.
Yeah.
And so
That's a great point.
It's surprising to me that nobody's pointed this out.
So it's exceptionally potent criticism of the current Israeli government.
Not just that, but he's from New York.
Right.
And not just the senator from the entire state of New York, but prior to his period in the Senate, he was a member of the House of Representatives from New York City. So if anybody can be thought of as representative of the Jewish American community writ large in the United States, it's somebody like Chuck Schumer.
Chuck Schumer, right.
And now, mind you, Chuck Schumer isn't going to lose his next election over this, right? He's pretty safe.
Sure. He doesn't have to carry Michigan.
No. But another thing that is not happening is that Chuck Schumer is not making that speech without sign off from the White House.
Right. Right. My second question about history and how they will view our moment is, I don't care to address this in a political context in the United States. You and I have gone on enough about how Joe Biden's performance in the most fraught moments since the end of the Second World War have, in our estimation, earned him great respect. But will American leadership in the world be viewed as somehow having been rehabilitated by the fact that it is Biden, perhaps quietly, but the Biden administration that is keeping the whole thing from boiling over in so many different regions, but in particular the Middle East?
I think that Biden's presidency will more likely be viewed as having arrested the precipitous decline of American influence, that he's done his best to try and preserve it. But I believe that American influence was just going to decline anyway across the world, mainly for demographic reasons.
Sure.
Right? Demographic and economic reasons, right? There was no reason for it to actually persist in the way that it has been. But
in this moment when somebody has had to get everybody on side.
Yes, I would agree with that. He has helped preserve it.
Only because he's old enough to remember when that's just what the United States did.
Yeah, but that might actually be a liability in some sense, right? Is that he's trying to cling to a world that's vanishing.
Right. I guess the greatest example of that would be his slow walking, his distancing from Netanyahu.
Yes, and I think that's why so many other people think that he should have done it more quickly.
To China, to Beijing. President Xi meets with U.S. business leaders Wednesday during the China Development Forum.
Excuse me. He met on the sidelines, in fact, outside of the China Development Forum.
Oh, that's right. It was like a auxiliary meeting.
It was an add-on, yes.
Yeah. An annex. This comes one day after U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen criticized China's full-scale push into electric vehicle and lithium battery manufacturing. And I hadn't really thought about this, right? You and I have discussed China's big push to have, 4.5 million charging stations for electric vehicles.
No, they have 4 million charging stations.
Right, but because they have prioritized it, they've made it happen. Batteries are now better and more powerful and cheaper and smaller than ever. And I know that because I own several kind of, power packs around my life for various media things, when I'm on the go. And Yellen says, in the past, this is a quote, in the past, industries like steel and aluminum, Chinese government support led to substantial overinvestment and excess capacity that Chinese firms look to export abroad at depressed prices. Yellen went on to say, this maintained production and employment in China, but forced industry in the rest of the world to contract. End of quote. Yellen made that statement at a solar panel plant in Georgia that I think at least one iteration of that business had been forced to close in 2017. And so she was trying to illustrate this point of China's government with their command economy can kind of flood the market with cheap stuff and distort. And I mean, she didn't use economic warfare, but put other businesses out of business in other countries.
Now, she's right about that.
But we still need electric vehicles and batteries, right?
That's right. And
And I buy Chinese batteries all the time.
Of course you do. I generally admire Secretary Yellen.
As an aside, we are in a golden age of like economic leadership between Powell and Yellen. These are by far the two most entertaining personalities, such as it is for these positions ever. Yes. Sorry, carry on.
However, no Western government official should complain about China dumping their excess industrial capacity on the rest of the world, because that's why they had the Opium Wars, right? Is because Britain wanted to.
That's 200 years ago. Come on.
Fine.
I'm teasing.
Right? But Britain wanted to sell its industrial wares in China, then as now a very populous country. China said
a big market, even in the 19th century.
Yes, China said no, thank you, and the result was war. Now that's a
couple of them.
Yeah, that's sort of an oversimplification.
No, but I say it. Okay, so it's rich. It's a bit rich for the West to say, "Hey, China, don't distort our economies by dumping your glut of product into our markets."
Yes, not just that though. This is a very touchy issue for China in terms of its national historical narrative.
Sure.
And American officials and Western officials more broadly should be cognizant of that and maybe a little bit more sensitive to that. Now, everything Janet Yellen said was true. That doesn't mean that she should have said so. But to return to Xi's meeting, this was actually originally reported last week by the Wall Street Journal, and then it was picked up by Reuters early this week.
Like this is going to happen.
Yes, but it was all on deep background. There were no attributions. And this is weird, okay? Usually when Xi Jinping is going to do something, you know about it. They tell you about it. The Global Times, the Communist Party English language news outlet, they quoted the Reuters story. And so apparently
that's very unusual.
Yes, they didn't even get the heads up about this.
Now, why would she want to keep that under wraps? He's meeting with American business leaders in Beijing. He's helping China's economy. Okay. Why on earth would you be secretive about that?
In the China the China Development Forum, usually these business leaders meet with the premier, who in this year is Li Qiang. That didn't happen.
Right. And that raised some eyebrows.
Yeah. And it sort of feels like now all these business leaders showed up for the development forum. They all said, "What boy, China's great. We love China. We can't wait, blah, blah, blah." Right. Which you have to do. Right. You can't show up in Beijing and go, "This place sucks." Right. I mean, but it seems like behind the scenes, they were like, "Okay, we're getting hosed here. We need to talk to the big guy," even though Xi had met with some business leaders here in the United States in San Francisco last November. That wasn't very long ago. What do you need to know? This did not seem to have gone especially well.
Apparently Xi doubled down on, we're not going to make this economy particularly free market. We're going to focus on centralization.
That's right. And
I can't imagine U.S. business leaders liking that.
No, I don't think so. And that seems to be the consensus view of in the sort of post-game wrap up.
Thanks CNBC for that one.
Yeah, there's a very interesting story that I literally read right before coming on the air today from Reuters that we'll put in the show notes that sort of wraps this whole thing up. But I think this is a story we're going to have to keep an eye on because this was very unusual, and it does sort of speak to the ongoing developments in the relationship between the economic relationship that is between China and the United States.
Bigger picture, though, if Xi is meeting with U.S. CEOs at any interval, no matter how well or poorly it goes, that generally means he's going to be disinclined to attack Taiwan, right?
I wouldn't go quite that far. I think that
you see what I'm getting at, though, right? Economic engagement ideally would reduce risk of war.
Yeah, but not if he's going to sit there and say, "Sorry, we're just going to do whatever we want," which seems to be what happened.
But then in future, those CEOs probably won't care to take the meeting.
I don't know. The problem is China, in spite of all its economic problems, is still an enormous market. They can't walk away. Right. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons they wanted to have the meeting. They're sort of sitting there going, we work with us. What can you give? Give us something, right? And so we'll have to see how this works out. It's going to be something to keep an eye on. But while we're on the subject of economics and coming to the end of this episode, we got inflation data this morning, which was moderate, unremarkable, except that it was exactly on the nose of what economists had predicted that it was going to be. Now, here on Working for Crusoe, we've spent no small amount of time poking fun at economists when they get their predictions wrong, which has been happening quite a lot lately. In fact, I would say that's one of the reasons we have this podcast at all.
Yes, because the egg brains are wrong.
That's right. But we should be
when they get it right
enough to say, good for you, economists, for getting it right. And I think it also speaks to an emerging sort of consensus about a new normal in the economy. Because after all, economic forecasting is difficult in unusual economic times, which we're living in today. So if economists are getting it right, and as we mentioned last week, investors are more in line with the Federal Reserve's view, it seems like everybody's kind of figuring out how this is going to work, and that's good too.
Email us, johnrameymedia@gmail.com. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Thanks for listening to Working for Crusoe. We'll talk to you next Friday.
Every Friday is a good Friday here on Working for Crusoe.